In business today, 3 things to know. First, smoke the Cuban cigars if you got them. Following the release of an American held in Cuba, President Obama announces sweeping changes in U.S. relations. The U.S. will open an embassy in Havana, and the president calls for the easing of the economic embargo. Is Cuba close to being open for business? Then, the U.S. Fed tells us which way the wind is blowing on interest rates. Did Janet Yellen and the group change policy at all today? And messy journalism. 2 major magazines are forced to retract high-profile stories in the rush to save its own industry. Are print magazines going for big headlines over actual reporting? Arise Exchange starts now. Hello, everyone. I'm Andrew Schmertz. We'll have all the news about Cuba in a moment. But first, stocks rallied as investors try to figure out what the U.S. Federal Reserve actually said today, because it's not so clear. The Fed bucked expectations and left in language that low interest rates would remain for a, quote, considerable time. But it changed this from a policy statement to a mere reference and said the central bankers would instead be, quote, patient before raising interest rates. Stocks like this because why not? Here are the final numbers. The Dow closing up almost 300 points. It was over 300 points for most of the day, to 288 to 17,356. The S&P 500 also rallying better than 2%. NASDAQ up 2% as well. Some of the top stocks we're watching today. Tesla taking a hit after an analyst at Morgan Stanley cut the company's sales expectations by 40% over low oil prices. Tesla closing down better than 4%. General Mills says weaker demand in the U.S. and Europe hurt quarterly profits. Net income fell to $346 million, or 56 cents per share. That's down from $550 million. GIS, though, up $1.08. And Federal Express says lower fuel costs helped to increase its margins despite missing analyst expectations. The company reporting net income of $616 million, up by 23% from $500 million last year. Taking a look at commodities, gold closing at $11.89.90 an ounce, and oil closing up to $56.12 a barrel. Some other economic news today. U.S. consumer prices fell in November by 3%. That's the largest drop in 6 years. Consumer prices up 0.3%, however, stemming from plunging oil prices. We'll have to check that number for you. I believe it's down 0.3%. Jeff DeMaso from Advisor Investors walks us through exactly what the Fed decided today. I'm going to call you the Fed whisperer today, so you can try to help parse the language, because they were a little bit all over the places. And if you go to the various financial websites, it was, considerable time was staying in, considerable time was coming out. What does it all mean?
Yeah, we like to kind of say, we were talking about on the research team at Advisor Investments, was we were saying they kind of put the lobster's in the pot. So they still have that considerable time in there, but they made this subtle shift to say we're going to be patient. So we see them starting to move towards this patience, and taking considerable time out. In her statement to the press, Janet Yellen was pretty adamant that we're going to be data dependent. So we're going to listen to the data. Right. But you should take patient to mean it's probably not going to be a rate hike in the next couple meetings.
All right, and someone asked what couple meant, and she said couple meant 2. So she at least defined that for us, exactly what couple meant. The key here, though, is why the change in language is basically signaling that they are starting to think in that direction.
Yep. We've known this Fed has been really deliberate. Yes. They've been as transparent as they can be, but they're being deliberate, and they're trying to keep the markets from being surprised. So this is really a baby step, just turning the heat up a little bit, saying, hey, we're moving towards normalization. Here's our first signal of that after we finish QE.
And as far as data dependency goes, what data are they looking at?
Well, the 2 big ones are going to be inflation and unemployment. We've seen unemployment improving, really in terms of, the overall employment number, looking at U.S., which is kind of bringing in kind of the marginally employed, people who would like jobs but maybe don't have them. That's coming down. And then clearly inflation, something that
and wage inflation, right? They want to see some movement in wages?
They do. And, they're really trying to look through the drop in oil. I think the CPI, as you said, came down today. But if you strip out food and energy and you look at that core number, November was actually up 0.1%.
We saw the markets rally today on this news. The markets have been getting pressured, though, because of falling oil prices. Oil prices may continue to fall. Will the markets at some point discount oil and move on?
Yeah, I think the markets have really done a lot of that already. The usual cast of suspects when oil's going down, energy companies, countries like Russia, like Venezuela have taken it on the chin. And you've got kind of the second level effect where retailers have done well as consumers have a little bit of money to spend. So I think the markets have done a pretty good job of responding and reacting to that already.
And overall, with the price falling in oil, we should see some better earnings news outside of the energy sector, shouldn't we?
Yeah, you think that would, it's a tax cut. If you're paying less at the pump, you've got more money to spend elsewhere. Consumer-driven economy, that definitely helps. For the large multinational companies, though, it does signal a little bit of weaker demand overseas. So maybe that filters through, but we'll kind of have to see how that plays out.
I think Janet Yellen's upset that she got upstaged by Cuba today. But on the serious international question, though, how much is that going to play a role here? Because Europe is so challenged right now.
Europe is definitely challenged. China's slowing a bit as well. So we could see that kind of come through a little bit in terms of those earnings for the large multinational companies. But the U.S. is still looking pretty good here. Manufacturing's up, industrial production's up, employment's improving.
We continue to get the data in the right movement.
Exactly.
Okay, Jeff, thank you. Good to see
Thanks,
you again.
Andrew.
Appreciate it. Well, now to Cuba, because the day began with a prisoner swap. By lunchtime, it was a sea change in relations between the United States and one of its closest neighbors but most hated adversaries, Cuba. This morning, Cuba released Alan Gross, an American who had been imprisoned in Cuba for 5 years. Gross is now back on U.S. soil. An unnamed Cuban spy was also released after 20 years. President Obama spoke for almost an hour with Cuban dictator Raul Castro, and then Mr. Obama announced that he was moving to normalize relations between the two countries.
We are taking steps to increase travel, commerce, and the flow of information to and from Cuba. This is fundamentally about freedom and openness, and also expresses my belief in the power of people-to-people engagement.
The president says he will ask Congress to lift the 50-year-old economic embargo. In the interim, he is taking executive action to establish an embassy in Havana and to expand travel and economic ties. Cuban President Castro also spoke.
We have agreed on the reestablishment of diplomatic relations. This does not mean that the principal issue has been resolved. The economic, commercial, and financial blockade that provoked enormous human and economic suffering on our country should end.
Some Democrats and many Republicans criticized the U.S. move, warning that Cuba remains a dictatorship with a terrible human rights record. Florida Senator Marco Rubio blasted the president.
These changes will lead to legitimacy for a government that shamelessly, continuously abuses human rights, but it will not lead to assistance for those whose rights are being abused. It is just another concession to a tyranny by the Obama administration.
Our Washington correspondent Leila McDowell, who has traveled to Cuba, is here with the fallout in D.C. Leila, I'm going to have to ask you, what kind of a surprise was this today? Because many people were caught off guard.
It was a big surprise. I mean, we are watching history unfold, and look, these talks were potentially explosive, so they had to be held in secret for 18 months, and that's a long time to keep a secret in Washington. But there were a few staunch allies of the president's policies, like Democrat Chris Holland, who did go down to free Alan Gross, who were in the loop, but not that many. Obama didn't want anything to disrupt what was going on, which will surely cement his legacy in history.
And he did have a Republican supporter, Representative Jeffrey Flake, I think, correct? Who was on the plane as well.
That's exactly right. And there's quite a number of Republicans who support the lifting of the embargo, particularly because so much of U.S. business does support it.
Yeah, so now that question goes to Congress. There's only so much president can do by executive order. What will the new Congress, it will be Republican control, do you think when it comes to the embargo? What are people saying?
Well, yeah, and that's the big problem, Andrew. I mean, it is the million-dollar question, well, literally billion-dollar question because of the potential profits. But that's why big business groups like the Chamber of Commerce have lobbied to end the embargo. But the leading Republican potential presidential candidates, as you heard from Marco Rubio, are already slamming it, saying that it's giving in to a dictator, it's a bad idea, and so on. And remember, those anti-Castro Cuban votes in Miami, while smaller than some years ago, are still pretty important to the Republican base. Republicans will control Congress next year, and they can do a lot to even stop the progress on the executive action because they've got control over those purse strings. So while a new embassy is scheduled to be built, they could say no to funding it. So my bet is we're not going to see Yeah, and we're not going to see the embargo likely to be lifted next year, but you never know. I mean, there's a lot of pressure from business and even from the Pope Francis.
You mentioned Miami. It's really important to remember that Florida is a swing state. And so the Republicans, obviously, because of all of the Cuban immigrants in Miami, have a sort of a horse in the fight there to keep that. What kind of industries are going to benefit if the embargo is lifted?
Yeah, well, quite a bit. I mean, you're looking at agricultural, medical industry, manufacturing, and tourism as some of the biggest that could profit. The Chamber of Commerce actually pegs the cost to the U.S. economy of the embargo, Andrew, at $1.2 billion per year. So, and right now you can't just go to Travelocity and buy a ticket to go, or go to the cigar store and get one of those sought-after Cuban cigars or that great rum, because the embargo's still in place. So once there's lifted, there's also a lot of profit to be made there.
Yeah, tourism, obviously some goods. The Cubans use the greenback, correct? So they sort of have felt the pressure because they're using the American dollar.
That's exactly right. And once tourism opens up, I think we're going to see a lot. I mean, when I would go to Cuba, I always would meet these bass fishermen, and these are predominantly Republicans from Midwest states. They just love to fish, but they are all for lifting that embargo.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, when you do travel to Cuba, the reaction, do you think, from the Cuban people being able to do some trade with the United States? And will this go beyond any economic benefits? I mean, was there any conversation here about political reform?
Well, there is. I mean, that's the argument that people who support lifting the embargo say, is that once you have more interaction, more tourism, more cultural exchange, there's going to be greater influence on the Cuban people. And those who want to isolate Cuba say, no, that's, as long as we start bringing in economic dollars, it's going to shore up a regime that the United States is very much opposed to.
Okay, Leila in Washington, D.C. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up, industries you may not think about that benefit from lower oil prices. You're watching Arise Exchange. Stay with us.
There is a reason Africa is called the new frontier. What was once potential is now an opportunity ready to be seized. Once revered for our resources, today's wealth lies in our people. People who build the cities that shape the future. People who know an idea in one place means business in another. A generation for whom technology means there are no borders, no boundaries. We are the new lions in a brave new world. Kings of the urban jungle. And there's a bank that puts the world in our pocket and the future in our hands. UBA, Africa's global bank.
Apple unveiled new products today. Did it meet expectations?
Apple stock is up 20%.
The White House says it has proper measures to contain the spread of Ebola.
This seems to be, in some ways, exploding. What are officials saying?
We remain focused on working with our partners on the ground to stop the epidemic.
Enhanced measures have been put in place in Africa and the United States.
This is hitting home in a very real way, and I think, we need to be concerned.
Hello and welcome to Arise America. I'm Debbie Turner-Bell.
Welcome back to Arise Exchange. Although plunging oil prices over the past 6 months has begun to hurt the U.S. energy producers, it's welcome news for many others, including the airlines and automakers. Joining us to talk about which sectors are benefiting from the lower oil price is Daniel Dicker. He's senior contributor to TheStreet.com and OilPrice.com, and also the author of Oil's Endless Bid. Dan, welcome back to Arise Exchange. Good to see you.
Thanks, Andrew.
This is just a great story that just keeps coming every single day about the sudden collapse.
Unless you're in the oil industry.
Unless you're in the oil industry.
It's not so much fun, right?
Well, I'm not saying it's fun for them. It's fun for us.
Right.
We're in the news business,
Indeed.
right? So, we're talking a lot about what's driving it. But, is it at some point, when is it oversold? Is there a metric that you can determine that says this is oversold?
It's fundamentally oversold now in that if you had sustained prices here, $56, $57, a lot of the production here in the United States and in Canada and Brazil elsewhere becomes unviable. It doesn't become profitable. ultimately that production comes out of the system and you run into a tremendous shortage of supply. But that's a long-haul event that happens if prices stay sustained down here. Oil companies, the last thing they want to do is they want to cut production, or the last thing they want to do is be the first to cut production.
So do you think right now, if you look at U.S. oil companies and shale production, are we seeing a level that, I mean, are we seeing it drop?
Well, what we're seeing is we're seeing some indications now that in the near future production levels will drop. We've seen, for example, rigs, the permits for rigs go down to an extreme degree, almost 40% over the last several weeks. We've seen CapEx, that is the money that oil companies will spend going into 2015, absolutely slashed by just about everyone. Now, the oil companies have slashed these productions while still advising that their production will in fact grow. This is a Sesame Street game of equations where one thing does not agree with the other. So what we have is a lot of smoke coming out of the oil and gas industry, which is being met by a reality that will cease, but only we will see that maybe in the spring, 4 or 5 months in the future.
Is this a game of chicken now between OPEC and the U.S. producers?
Oh, it absolutely is, but it's not really a game of chicken. I think it's more a game of chicken between the U.S. producers themselves. Who is most scalable here in terms of production? Is it the oil sand players in Canada? Or is it the offshore deep water drillers in the Gulf of Mexico? Or is it in fact those shale players? And if it is in those shale players, which one of these shale players? Is it the ones in the Bakken? Is it the ones in Texas? Is it the ones in Mississippi? Who will flinch first in terms of slashing production? That's really the game that we're playing as oil analysts and oil traders, trying to find which companies are more apt to bow out, go broke, be merged, and those that will come through the rain.
So it might be a time for a little bit of a shakeout then in the shale industry.
No doubt. And it's already beginning to a certain degree. Repsol, in fact, bought a Canadian company, Talisman Energy, 2 days ago. I think they overpaid. They didn't wait long enough for, in fact, these prices to be affected. But that's the kind of merger talk and merger activity that we're going to have to see a lot more of before I think that these prices in oil have bottomed.
If we hit $40 a barrel, what does the world look like?
A very good question. It depends on which part of the world you're standing in. The Russians have a major problem. The Iranians have a major problem. The Venezuelans may have a civil war type problem. Here in the United States, we actually also have a problem. We're a little bit more dependent upon petrodollars in this country for jobs, for growth,
because
for
our
tax
oil
revenue,
production has grown.
Indeed.
Is there any, I don't want to get to conspiracy theories, is there anybody in the U.S. government talking to energy companies and saying we like the low oil prices for now?
I haven't heard of such a thing. It's been a dangerous kind of game to play. Who benefits, who doesn't benefit? You talk a little bit about retail, airlines. Clearly they're on the beneficiary side, but the losers are pretty large too. U.S. oil companies make up a large part of this economy.
Anybody in the petroleum that uses petroleum products, I guess it would be benefiting from this, correct?
It has, but it hasn't really shown up too much in the stocks. Material stocks have done almost as poorly as energy stocks. That's been a sort of a strange kind of disconnect that I haven't really understood. But in fact, you're right. It should be the chemical companies that do well. It should be those producers who rely on commodity costs to do well.
I would think that top line earnings or bottom line earnings would improve for companies that are in the space where they pay a lot for oil.
And I think it will. The problem is that there is the disconnect. I've never seen such a collapse in commodity prices without a significant collapse in other asset prices as well.
Okay.
So that disconnect is something that we're really trying to figure out here. Is oil a canary in a coal mine? Is it telling us about maybe a further disaster in other sectors of the economy yet to come? Or is it just a one-off, one of itself, and will not really affect the U.S. economy as a whole?
Daniel Dicker, the author of Oil's Endless Bid. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Good to see
Andrew.
you.
Sure.
Time now for our business ticker stories making headlines across the nation and the world. We have some breaking news at this hour. The fallout from Sony's hacking scandal continues. Sony has completely canceled the release of The Interview, a satire based on North Korea's dictator starring Seth Rogen and James Franco. After breaching Sony's computer network, hackers loyal to the dictator allegedly threatened to attack audiences of the film, leading several theaters and now Sony to drop the picture. Well, take that, Russia. Now you can't get an iPhone and an iPad anymore. Apple has stopped online sales of its merchandise in the country as the ruble continues to drop in value despite Russia's central bank intervention. Meantime, Russians are clamoring to the stores to stock up on necessities, for example, like cheese, before prices skyrocket as the ruble continues to fall. The embattled head of American Apparel has finally gotten the boot. American Apparel CEO Dov Charney has been fired after allegations of sexual harassment against employees. Charney had been suspended since June after several employees accused him of misconduct. And would you like small fries with that? McDonald's in Japan is ordering its stores to only offer small-size French fries due to a supply shortage. The West Coast ports that export most of the frozen French fries are in the midst of a labor dispute. We've been reporting on that here. And that has delayed delivery of the spuds by weeks. Coming up, ever lock yourself out of your car? How about locking yourself in? Our favorite person of the day is next. Stay with us.
The fallout continues in Washington following Tuesday's scathing Senate Intelligence Committee report. Does this put Americans and America at risk?
Torture should have consequences. Torture is not a policy choice.
CIA managers and interrogators were uncomfortable with what they were being asked to do.
Widespread demonstrations are continuing for yet another night.
We are at a point of moral crisis. We are at a state of emergency for Black Americans here.
Hello and welcome to Arise America. I'm Debbie Turner-Bell.
Informative. The U.S. economy is on the right path, and the wizard of the Fed is leading the way.
We started our companies originally to create something that made a positive difference.
Compelling.
I became very successful, not allowing myself to be average.
Our favorite person of the day, when we pick one person who grabbed our attention, and not for the right reason. Yeah, he sort of lost all business. Investors came back from the long weekend, tanned, rested, and ready to buy stocks. Entertaining money daily, Arise Exchange.
I think that people in America do care about what happens throughout the world.
Global warming is probably something that has to be addressed sooner rather than later.
From Somalia and the genocide there, and that's something people don't know about. They have no idea the brevity of that situation.
The first thing I think about when I think of Africa is like war and famine and disease.
And right now with the tsunami that happened or the earthquakes in, Japan, we always look out for other people.
Arise News, every culture, every angle.
Time now for our favorite person of the day, when we pick one person who grabbed our attention and not for the right reasons. Today, it is a couple from New Zealand who took the concept of losing car keys to a whole new level. Brian and Molly Ann Smith managed to lock themselves in their new car for 13 hours, unable to get out. The clueless couple forgot to bring the electronic tag that allows the doors of the keyless Mazda car to be unlocked. So they figured that there was no way out. They also forgot to bring the car manual or a cell phone with them, so for 13 hours they were trapped. As it turns out, all they had to do to unlock the car manually was use the door handle. The couple, both in their 60s, claims they honked constantly, but because it was Guy Fawkes Day in New Zealand, everyone was out having a good time and no one heard them. Well, now the two will always remember. The 5th of November. It's a little Guy Fawkes humor for you. The two were treated for dehydration and are now on a mission to educate people about how not to get locked inside your car. And so Brian and Molly Ann Smith are our favorite people of the day. Coming up, our magazine's using junk journalism to save their own skin. You're watching Arise Exchange. Stay with us.
Unrest continues in Ferguson, Missouri. Exactly what happened to Michael Brown Jr.'s memorial. The NFL fallout continues. Why does this video change the game? President Barack Obama met with congressional leaders today.
He does not need congressional approval to carry out the strikes.
The only language understood by killers like this is the language of force.
Do I want to have a draft? No, because I don't want to have war.
Hello and welcome to Arise America. I'm Debbie Turner-Bell.
Global. It's Monday, so it must be time for a new round of sanctions against Russia. Nigeria is open for business, and you are getting a handle on this situation. Compelling. Time for liquid lunch, things that make us want to drink. Could she have been separated at birth from, say, Grimace? All business.
Money's coming out of these countries, and that flow is part of what's driving the equity markets.
Entertaining money daily.
It's about reimagining.
Arise Exchange. Well, it's nothing new in the journalism world. A race to reel in readers. Magazines splash shocking headlines on its covers to attract buyers. This week, New York Magazine published a piece about a so-called millionaire teenager trader that turned out to be a fraud. And Rolling Stone had to backtrack after its piece on a University of Virginia student whose account about being raped is now being disputed. Paul Levinson is a professor of communications and media studies at Fordham University and the author of New Media. And he is here to shed some light on what is going on. Paul, thank you for joining us here today. These are vastly different stories and of a vastly different serious nature. But first, how did both magazines get this terribly wrong?
Well, New York Magazine just messed up because basically the story is a rather stupid story in any case. They were scammed, and that's just totally inexcusable.
But then the New York Post, not the bastion of journalism, followed along.
Right.
And doesn't that happen way too often in this industry? I mean, we're to blame as well. You know, glass houses and everything. We just follow whoever leads a story.
Well, absolutely. And social media are part of it too. All too often, the quote research that traditional media do is looking at Twitter. And you have to do more than that. But to get to Rolling Stone, that's a completely different situation. They uncovered a very grievous situation, rapes going on college campuses, and they got some things a little wrong. But the story itself is an extremely important, extremely critical story for Americans to know about. So I think there's been far too much criticism of Rolling Stone and, frankly, not enough praise for their uncovering the story.
Yeah, they haven't retracted the whole idea of the story, just that they did not interview certain people along the way.
That's right.
The idea of either sensationalistic journalism or muckraking journalism, I mean, goes back to William Randolph Hearst and the idea of crusading journalism. I often say that the country was built on advocacy journalism. Is certainly nothing new. But what kind of pressure does the print media now face in the world of the constant, like you said, Twitter sphere?
A little more pressure than 100 years ago, but not that much, because apropos of Hearst, what was going on, say, in 1900, when all you had were newspapers, no television, not even radio, you had dozens of newspapers sometimes in big cities, and they were all competing to get out there with a story first, to get the headline out before anybody else, to scoop their competitors. So the pressure has always been on journalism, and that's why it developed these techniques of checking out their sources.
But in that era, you were competing on a level playing field in some ways. You're both using the same technology. When you turn to the magazine industry, does the magazine industry feel like they need to offer something a little bit more? And possibly that's in-depth journalism, but at the same point, it comes at a price.
Well, they want to stay current. No one wants to be yesterday's news. But again, in the case of Rolling Stone, they didn't rush the article. They did do a lot of work, and they did report an extremely important story. And in some ways, the most ridiculous aspect of that is the other media, like the New York Times. I saw Bill Keller on a television show attacking Rolling Stone. You talk about people living in glass houses.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. And by the way, Rolling Stone had to retract its retraction, correct? I mean, it kind of went a little bit further in basically damning this woman than the accuser.
It wasn't the most artful retraction. There's no doubt about it. But that's a small footnote to this vastly important story.
And generally speaking, when you look at the magazine industry now and you look at the newspaper industry, do you find that it's starting to carve out a space for it in the new media world? Because we look at what happened with New Republic and that debacle there. Or are we talking about a press that's ultimately, making, as they say, buggy whips for horses?
If we're talking about papers as paper you can hold in your hand, obviously that has shrunk and it's going to continue to shrink, but there is still an extremely important niche for good journalism. So, for example, I read the Rolling Stone story online, and you don't need to actually hold a physical paper in your hand anymore.
Okay. Paul Levinson, professor of communications and media studies at Fordham University and the author of New Media. Thank you for coming by. Hope to see you again.
My pleasure.
And tomorrow on Rise Exchange, we're going to continue to examine how falling oil prices are impacting various portions of the economy. Let's take a look at the markets. Once again, a big rally for the street today, all thanks to Janet Yellen and some mixed messages that she sent. But basically the idea that interest rates are going to remain where they are, nearly at zero for a while. Dow finishing up 288 points to 17,356. The S&P 500 and the NASDAQ all better than 2% for the day. I'm Andrew Schmertz. Thanks for watching Rise Exchange, and we will see you here tomorrow. Stay right there.